within Asia. And how do they exercise control? They will have these monthly reporting calls. So you will have the Indian company preparing an MIS. They will send it to Singapore, and Singapore will say that no, your budget is off target. You need to reduce your costs. You are given a certain budget to spend on advertising, but where is the productivity of your advertising? Your sales have not increased, so you need to reduce. What is this function? This is a function which is trying to manage the risk. Okay, so optically it may seem that Indian company is actually doing everything. Okay, Indian company is investing in the Indian market, it's incurring advertising expenditure, it's spending money in the market. But where is the really the control function behind all of this? The control function behind all of this is sitting in Singapore. Okay, so when you say control, it essentially means that you are taking decisions which creates the risk. You're taking decisions which puts the organization's capital at risk. And then you're taking decisions to monitor risk, the assumption of risk on a day-to-day basis. If that can be seen to be located in a geography such as Singapore, then it is Singapore which will be entitled to commensurate reward for that function, which conversely means that whatever is happening in India is a routine function, and therefore whatever is the reward associated with that routine function India should get. And if there is a surplus, then that surplus should belong to Singapore. Now that surplus may be a profit, may be a loss, but that surplus should be assumed by Singapore. So that's the consequence of risk allocation. The entity which bears the risk should bear the costs that may arise from the realization of the risk. And generally that entity should be compensated with an increase in the expected return. The realized return could be anything else. As I mentioned, the surplus that goes to Singapore in the example that I gave you may be a loss as well. Okay. Now, in transfer pricing, when you talk of business restructuring arrangements, one needs to assess whether the risk which is supposedly proposed to be transferred, whether it is really economically significant, and whether substantial profit potential really attaches to that risk. Okay. So for example, let's assume the case of a distributor entity, right? Now let's say that distributor entity, it goes to a customer in India, and the customer places a purchase order, and then that distribution entity does a back-to-back purchase order on the parent company. Okay, so the Indian distribution entity takes flash title to the goods, and sometimes it may transfer title on ICs as well, and then in a short period of time, the title to the goods is automatically transferred to the Indian customer. So optically, it may seem that this entity is a distribution entity because it is carrying risks that a distributor usually carries, namely credit risk and inventory risk. But if you really see what is happening, because of the ordering process, where the customer places an order and then the Indian company places a back-to-back, there is actually no inventory risk. The distributor entity is just taking flash title to the goods and transferring title. So even in this kind of a situation, if you write up a contract where inventory risk is effectively borne by the foreign party, it's not going to be inconsistent with the economic substance of the arrangement, because the Indian company never had inventory risk to begin with. So before you get into assessing whether the Indian company should be rewarded for giving up a profit potential through a reallocation of risk, one needs to first assess whether that risk is actually economically significant. And only if it is economically significant, in other words, the profit potential attached to that risk is significant, should there be a question of an exit charge. Now, again in transfer pricing, we often come up with an argument which is made that this entity is a cost plus entity and therefore it doesn't have any risks. Okay? Why? Because irrespective of the economic conditions, that entity will always get a plus on cost. So it gets a steady return. Now bear in mind that the cost plus method is an outcome of the risks that the entity takes, and it is not in itself a determinant of the risk that it takes. Because if you go by the principle that risk follows functions, if the functions undertaken by the entity are such that it creates risks, or if they are undertaking functions that manage the risk, then it cannot have a steady return to begin with. So in that case, a cost plus model will be a misnomer. Okay. So now, some of these principles that I'm talking about, now these are very fundamental principles of transfer pricing, and some of these principles are not always relevant in the context of a business restructuring exercise, but these are also the cornerstones on which you will assess a business restructuring arrangement. Part 2 of OECD's literature deals with arm's length compensation for the restructuring itself. So when a restructuring happens, should the restructured entity be rewarded in the form of a one-time compensation? So that's essentially the subject matter of this chapter. Now, even before you get into whether the Indian entity should be rewarded with an arm's length compensation for a restructuring, the first thing that one needs to assess is whether the conditions that are made or imposed in dealings between the two associated enterprises, whether those conditions are such that would have been entered between unrelated parties operating under uncontrolled conditions. So that's something that one needs to first assess. In other words, is the restructuring itself arm's length? Because you can then go on to compute the arm's length compensation. But the first question is the manner in which the authorities, the taxpayer entities have actually structured the transaction. Is that manner in which it is executed, is it really arm's length by itself? And that's where, to be able to answer that question, one needs to first take a look at the restructuring itself very closely. What does that mean? It essentially means that a comparison needs to be made between what was actually happening versus what is going to happen. What has really changed? Okay. And so I'll give you an example. Let us say there is an Indian distributor, and let's assume for discussion's sake that distribution entity is positioned as a risk-bearing normal distributor who is assuming strategic decision-making for the local market. All right. Now in this situation, let's assume because of the fact that the risk-bearing distributor was taking risks and taking decisions, let's assume the transfer pricing policy is such that such a distributor should be rewarded with a 40% gross profit margin. Now that 40% gross profit margin should be adequate to cover the costs of the distributor, and that should leave an appropriate return for the distributor, right? So because here the distributor is a risk-bearing distributor, the distributor in the initial years of his operations continues to make a lot of investments in the market. So they invest on advertising, they invest on creating a supply chain, a distribution network. So the costs which are below the gross profit line are significantly larger, the volumes are not there. As a result of which, while the distributor earns a 40% gross profit margin, it may or may not earn the right operating margin. Okay. Now, in this type of a situation, let us say first 4 years the distributor makes a loss, and then after 4 years, the volumes start picking up, and as a result of that, while the gross profit margin remains at 40%, from the 4th year onwards, because of higher volumes, the fixed overheads are better absorbed, and therefore it starts making operating profit. Okay, so here is a distributor who initially made losses, from the 4th year onwards starts making profits, and as he invests more and more in the Indian market, obviously he will keep the entire reward. His GP margin will remain flat at 40, but his operating margin can swing depending upon how much investment he makes and how much risks he takes. In this situation, if the parent company suddenly says that I want to convert you from a risk-bearing distributor to a low-risk distributor, So I'll start giving you a steady return from tomorrow. Tomorrow onwards you will make a 3% margin, fixed return. You will not make profits, you will not make losses. 3% आपको मिलेगा. Question really is that if all that is changing in this arrangement is just the contract, and the distributor continues to do exactly what he did in the past, then that's not something that the tax authorities will respect. Okay, so which is the first point, that one needs to understand what has really changed in this. And in that one needs to assess, what were the rights and obligations of the distribution entity. And I'm just taking an example of distribution entity, but the principle will apply to all types of reorganizations. So what were the rights and obligations of the distribution entity? And to what extent, so the manner and extent to which these rights and obligations of that entity have undergone a change. Okay? And therefore, one needs to hypothesize here. One needs to hypothesize that this is what was happening, this is what is going to happen, and therefore, there is a change. OECD cautions tax authorities here not to use hindsight in assessing these transactions. So you may undertake a transaction with a certain thinking in mind, but that thinking may or may not materialize in the future. Okay, so you should generally not use hindsight. So hindsight is an indicator of whether the parties behaved in a rational, commercially rational way when they undertook a restructuring, but that's not necessarily conclusive. So the idea is to avoid the use of hindsight. Second point, to see whether the restructuring itself is arm's length, is to understand the business reasons for and the expected benefits from the restructuring, including the role of synergies. So this gets into understanding why did the restructuring take place to begin with. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the session, that multinationals undertake these decisions sometimes for centralization of functions, or to deal with increased competition, or to behave in a more cost-efficient way and therefore to gain benefit from synergies. So there can be n number of reasons why restructurings take place. And one should try to understand the business reasons for and the benefits that are expected from the restructuring. Now, one important principle that the OECD has stated over there is that often you will see restructuring making a lot of commercial sense at the group level. But when you answer this question, you have to drill it down to the legal entity level. So whether there is a commercially, logical reason why restructuring takes place or not, that is something that has to be tested at the legal entity level and not at the group level. So at the group level, it may make immense sense to undertake a certain structure. But, transfer pricing is a local subject, and arm's length standard has to be applied at the level of each legal entity, and therefore whether that restructuring makes sense for that legal entity or not is something that has to be tested. Also, when you are when restructuring is attempted to be done to derive, let's say, synergies, okay, one should, as far as possible, document what are the nature of synergies that you expect to derive, and under what circumstances and assumptions those synergies will actually realize. Because you can, because again this goes back to the point of not to use hindsight in validating transactions. Because you may have undertaken a restructuring to derive a certain synergy, but that synergy may or may not realize in the future. And therefore, how do you really prove to the satisfaction of the authorities that you behave, when you restructured yourself, you behaved in a commercially rational way? How do you prove it? And therefore, the only way to really prove it is to document that I expect to derive these synergies from this restructuring, and these are the situations or assumptions behind which these synergies are expected to realize. They may or may not actually realize in the future, but this is the assumption under which I think they will realize. Now, one more important point, which goes back to the point on avoiding hindsight, is that let's assume that you expect to derive certain synergies on account of restructuring. Now, the realization of those synergies does not necessarily mean that the profit of the enterprise is necessarily going to increase because of expected synergies. So, whether those synergies have been realized and whether the entity has actually been benefited should not be viewed qua the past profits of that entity, but the future profits of the entity with or without synergies. So let's take an example. Let's say an Indian company is earning a 15% margin, okay, and but that Indian company expects that there is going to be a substantial change in law, as a result of which the Indian company, the profitability is going to be significantly impacted, all right, and therefore the profitability is going to fluctuate widely in the future. And to get around that issue, the Indian company decides to restructure, right? Now, let's say the primary objective of the restructuring is that because of restructuring, you expect to derive certain benefits. Now, whether those benefits have been realized or not should not be viewed qua the 15% margin that it was earning in the past, because that's not a reference point. You have to look at, I did this restructuring because if I would not have done it, my profits would have fluctuated from this level to this level. And now because of this restructuring, I'm insulating myself from those risks. And therefore, the benefits have to be viewed qua what I expected to realize as opposed to what I was realizing in the past. The second point, the third point is on other options realistically available to the parties. Now again, this is an extremely important point in transfer pricing analysis to evaluate whether the restructuring itself is arm's length. Now, under ordinary circumstances, independent third parties, when they undertake business decisions, they would usually not undertake business decisions unless that decision does not make them worse off from the other options that they have. Okay? And therefore, to understand whether a restructuring is arm's length or not, one needs to articulate that if this restructuring would not have been undertaken, or if this Indian company refuses to restructure, what would have been the options that would have been realistically available to it? Okay, so I'll give you an example. Let us say, coming back to the example of a distributor. Let's say the distributor is a low-risk distributor. And in transfer pricing, low-risk distributor means that that distributor has very, very simple functions. It's just a buy and sell company. So it stocks the goods and sells. It virtually does not undertake any marketing. All right, something like a stockist, in loose words. Right. Now, a stockist is a B2B company. It's not really a B2C company. Right. So in such a situation, let's say that stockist is earning a 15% margin on sales, and the foreign company says that, look, what is your function? You buy from me and you sell to a wholesaler, right? You don't have any customer relationships, because most of the customer relationships the foreign company manages with the wholesaler. Your only function is that you import, you stock, and you sell, right? You have no customer relationships here, because most of those decisions I take. I'm sitting outside of India, and therefore, why do you really need a 15% margin? Normal distributors earn 3%, so I should give you only 3%. Now, here is a case where there is a substantial renegotiation of an existing agreement, right? And in this type of a situation, the question arises that if you have to see whether this proposal to restructure is arm's length or not, one of the essential components that one will have to delve into is what are the options that are realistically available to this distributor in terms of whether it should agree to this kind of a proposal or not. Okay? So in this case, this distributor thinks that what happens if I do not agree with this? If I do not agree with this, the parent company will simply terminate my license and they will go to some other distributor. Correct? Where does that leave me? The distributor thinks that I was foolish enough not to create customer relationships, because if I had created those customer relationships, then I would have been important to the parent company. Then it would not have been so easy for the parent company to terminate my license. But today I am in a situation where I do not carry any intangible assets, and therefore there is nothing that I could do but to agree to the restructuring. Okay, but let's assume you are a distributor who has invested significantly in the domestic market. All right. So you created a supply chain structure, thousands of CNH agents across the country. You had those relationships with your wholesalers, with your distributors. So you had a massive distribution chain, right? In this type of a situation, the distribution entity will have significant bargaining power, right? And then when the foreign company comes in and says that, look, I want to restructure you, I want to take away your 15% margin, I'll give you a 3% margin from here onwards. This is something where the foreign company cannot afford to do, and the Indian company would not ever agree to do this without having received an appropriate compensation. Because if he agrees to the restructuring, without a compensation, he's actually parting with a source of a value that it has, which is the relationships. And this is an example where theoretically the Indian company has a realistic option available, which is to terminate the arrangement itself and take that distribution chain to some other party who will reward him appropriately. So this is again a very important consideration, and whenever in transfer pricing one is documenting an appropriate defense to a restructuring arrangement, you would typically approach it by answering these three questions: that what has changed from what was there earlier, why did the restructuring take place, and what were the options that were realistically available to parties when they agreed to restructure. Okay. Now, documenting of options realistically available does not necessarily mean that you have to hypothesize 200 options and document all 200 options. It doesn't work like that. But yes, you should make an effort to document that if you wanted to not agree to the restructuring, what else could you have done, and why that restructuring option was better than your next best option. Reallocation of profit potential as a result of a business restructuring. Now, profit potential. So this is the second part of the inquiry. Now, in the first bullet, understanding the restructuring itself, you have established that the arrangement, in the manner in which it has been structured between the parties, is not arm's length. In other words, you may or may not have a third party comparable which shows that this is how independent third parties would behave, but you have checked all the boxes. So there is a valid reason for the restructuring. There is there is a bona fide reason which says that if I do this, this is how I will benefit. There is an analysis of options realistically available. So you checked all the relevant boxes. So just because an independent third party comparable is not available, you have good grounds to say that just because comparables do not exist doesn't mean that what I've done is a sham. Okay. Then you go to the next. Sorry, you have a question.
No, just one last point on whether other options are realistically available. For example, even if they are available, how does it materially change the buy? I mean, I can say that still I would like to go ahead with my group restructure.
No. So then in that case, let's assume you have other options which are available, but you still chose to accept the restructuring. Then you need to have good reasons to show why you accepted that restructuring. Because if you had better options available,
then why
okay,
from an arm's length point.
Then from an arm's length perspective, you cannot show that you have behaved in a commercially rational way. Okay, so this is very, very crucial, because very often a case is made by multinationals that, look, we have a hub and spoke model, we have a regional entrepreneur in Singapore. Singapore is taking all the decisions, and therefore all the entities in Asia should get low risk returns. Now that's not a wrong proposition, but let's assume you had an entity in India which was not structured as a low risk entity to begin with. It had some entrepreneurial functions to begin with. Now this restructuring may make immense sense at the regional level, but at the India level, should you not answer the question, why should India agree to this? Why should India agree to convert itself from a high risk and potentially a high reward earning entity to a low risk entity which just gets a steady return? Why should it agree? And that is where you come into answering these three questions. Okay, if you answer these three questions, and if you actually go into the four conditions in which GAR can be invoked by the authorities, if you actually apply your mind, you will see that these conditions are enshrined in those four conditions of GAR as well, although in a different language. Okay. Now, having satisfied yourself that a restructuring is something that independent third parties would have also done, okay, under similar circumstances, then the next question to answer is that is there transfer of profit potential which requires to be compensated. Now, profit potential here does not necessarily mean reduction in profits. So, a mere reduction in profit after a restructuring has taken place is not the same as transfer of profit potential. Okay. So, profit of potential essentially means transfer of something of value. Okay. It is in loose terms akin to transfer of a profit making apparatus in that sense. So, transfer of value could take the form of transfer of unique tangible assets. It can take the form of transfer of entrepreneurial functions that put the capital at risk, or it could take the form of transfer of rights. Okay. So one has to then assess that to what extent the Indian entity carried profit potential, and that answer would look at what were the rights of the Indian entity which are now transferred out or extinguished. What were the intangible assets that the Indian entity held, which are now proposed to be transferred. Now, sometimes you may have a situation where the intangible assets may not be transferred in legal form, but you may transfer the commercial right to exploit those assets. So, for legal purposes, sometimes the patents or trademarks may continue to be registered in the name of the same entity. Okay, but you may transfer the economic right to exploit that asset to somebody else. Similarly, whether decision-making functions or entrepreneurial functions are sought to be transferred out, and whether a profit potential attaches to that. So the important point around profit potential is that a mere drop in profits does not mean that there is transfer of profit potential. Okay, it needs to be something more than that. So, when OECD discusses transfer of something of value, it actually gives an example of a distributor, and it hypothesizes three different scenarios of a distributor. Let's take a distributor who is earning a profit over 5 years, which ranges from -2% to, let's say, -6%. Okay, and then the foreign company says that, look, you are not being profitable, -2 to -6. And assume that there was nothing wrong with the transfer pricing arrangement that existed. So -2 to -6 was an arm's length outcome, because this was a risk-bearing distributor. His gross profit margin was set at the right level, at say 40%. But because of business conditions, because of investments that the risk-bearing distributor was undertaking in the market, he was not able to generate a sufficient profit at the operating profit level. So 5 years trend shows, let's say he's earning -2 to -6. And then the foreign company says that, look, you are bearing significant amount of risks. I don't want you to bear significant amount of risks. Why not I give you a 2% operating margin henceforth, and I will take all your risks. And conversely, if you start becoming profitable, then obviously I will still leave 2% with you. The profit belongs to me. So that's one example. And there, now this example is, in terms of numbers, it's quite obvious that from the point of view of the distributor, this restructuring can make sense, because history would show that last 5 years he was never profitable, -2 to -6, and suddenly he has the ability to de-risk himself. And yes, logic would have it that the distributor has two options. Either he continues as a risk-bearing distributor and then potentially never becomes profitable in the future. So that's the realistic option available to him. Or alternatively agrees to the restructuring. But in that case, he loses the right to earn super profits in the future. Okay, so here the OECD says that, okay, it seems conceivable that a distributor will agree to the restructuring. Then there is a second example which is given, where you have a distributor who is earning profits, and let's say the profits over a 5-year period range from 0% on the lower side to 5% on the higher side. Okay, but the profits are inherently fluctuating. And again, in this type of a situation, the parent company says that, look, I'll give you 2% margin going forward. Now here again, to some extent, this arrangement is conceivable, because previously there were periods where the distributor made a 5% margin, which is higher than 2. And there were also periods where